Welcome to this AI debate on Theodicy. Can evil coexist with an all-loving God? Where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from God-Compatible and God-Incompatible. Now, God-Compatible.
Consider the physician who must choose a painful procedure now to avert a lifetime of illness later. That ethical tension helps us see how permitting some evils can be connected to enabling greater goods. When we translate that kind of clinical judgment into the metaphysical realm, the question becomes whether the admission of certain pains and wrongs in the world automatically contradicts the existence of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, or whether those admissions can instead be integrated into a coherent theistic account. My position is the latter. The existence of evil and suffering is compatible with a loving, all-powerful God, once we attend carefully to distinctions among types of problem, goods that require difficult conditions, limits on divine action, and the epistemic gap between finite creatures and an infinite mind. Alvin Plantinga's free will defense shows that the logical problem of evil, the claim that God and evil are logically incompatible, can be effectively blocked by recognizing that God might grant creatures genuine libertarian freedom, and that such freedom inherently carries the possibility of evil as the flip side of meaningful moral agency. If creating persons with real alternative possibilities is a greater good, then the existence of moral evil becomes an expected, though regrettable, outcome of a world that includes morally significant freedom. That matters because it preserves both divine goodness and the reality of moral responsibility without collapsing into a world of empty automatons whose goodness is either compelled or illusory. The soul-making Theodicy complements the free will defense by emphasizing the formative role hardships play in producing virtues that arguably could not exist otherwise. John Hick developed this line by arguing that qualities such as courage, compassion, and steadfastness typically emerge in response to adversity. A world without struggle might be a world with far fewer of the morally admirable traits we value. That is not to sentimentalize suffering, but to note that some goods plausibly require rough conditions to be realized, much as the steel is tempered by fire and not by a life of perpetual ease. Thinking in terms of trade-offs sharpens the point. An omnibenevolent God might permit painful means when those means are necessary or highly likely conditions for greater goods that would otherwise be absent. Drawing the comparison to the surgeon's choice again, sometimes present pain is instrumentally necessary to avoid far greater harm or to secure a richer set of goods over time. On the scale of cosmic providence, certain evils may play analogous, though morally costly roles that allow the realization of goods that outweigh them. This is not a claim that every suffering is justifiable on its face, only that the existence of some evils does not by itself falsify theism. Skeptical theism invites epistemic humility in assessing particular cases of apparent gratuitous suffering. It reminds us that our finite perspective is a poor guide to the full range of morally relevant reasons an omniscient being might have. What looks gratuitous to us may be part of a larger pattern of goods and relationships we cannot see. Stephen Wykstra has been influential in clarifying how this epistemic modesty undercuts strong evidential claims that certain instances of suffering make God's existence improbable, because those claims assume we have access to the kinds of reasons an all-knowing God would have. Turning to talk of omnipotence, it is crucial to appreciate metaphysical boundaries. Omnipotence, traditionally understood, does not entail the power to make contradictions true, and it does not include the ability to create genuinely free agents who necessarily choose the good, without thereby negating their freedom. Thomas Aquinas articulated this constraint by noting that divine omnipotence cannot perform logical impossibilities, and creating creatures who are both free and guaranteed never to do wrong falls into that impossible category. That point matters because many objections rest on a misunderstanding of divine power. Imagining God could, without cost, have fashioned a world with morally free beings who never sin, a metaphysical impossibility if freedom requires alternative possibilities. I do not deny that there are deeply troubling instances of what seems like gratuitous or horrendous suffering, and the theist must reckon with them with seriousness and moral urgency. But it is one thing to demand a theistic explanation, and another to claim that no reasonable theistic explanation is possible. The burden of proof rests on the claim that certain evils are truly gratuitous. And given the plausible defenses I've outlined, that burden is heavier than it first appears.
Now, God-Incompatible.
I remember reading an account of a small village leveled overnight by a storm, while search teams pulled out families who could not understand why this happened to them. That raw human confusion, why the innocent suffer, captures the practical force of theodicy. What I want to argue is straightforward. The amount, kinds, and apparently pointless nature of suffering we observe are incompatible with a being who is at once omnipotent and omnibenevolent. The contradiction shows up in two complementary forms: a tight logical objection that exposes inconsistency in the traditional divine attributes, and an evidential objection that treats the sheer scale and character of suffering as strong evidence against the hypothesis of such a God. Start with the logical form. If God is willing but not able to prevent gratuitous evil, then God lacks omnipotence. If able but not willing, then God lacks perfect goodness. And if both willing and able, the existence of gratuitous evil is inexplicable. That trilemma is not a rhetorical flourish, but a real logical pressure on the classical theistic package, and it forces theists to choose between changing an attribute of God or accepting a contradiction. This matters because theological claims should not be immune to straightforward logical assessment. If the attributes lead to contradiction under ordinary meanings of all-powerful and all-good, then either those attributes are being used idiosyncratically or the theistic hypothesis is incoherent. The evidential form strengthens the case by moving from logical possibility to probability. Even if a contradiction can be avoided in principle, the empirical character of suffering makes theism unlikely. Philosophers have pressed this point with vivid examples of apparently gratuitous, horrendous suffering that cry out for explanation, and the inference is probabilistic rather than deductive. That is why we must look at what the world actually contains: preventable child deaths, the flattened towns after massive storms, and the long trails of individual agony that do not seem to serve any greater good, and ask whether such facts are what we should expect from an omnipotent, omnibenevolent creator. Consider the preventable deaths of children from treatable illnesses. Their continued existence in large numbers demands a specific theodical explanation from theist accounts rather than an appeal to abstract possibilities. The plight of children who die for lack of medicine or sanitation is not a marginal oddity. It is a pattern that magnifies the evidential problem and calls for concrete reasons why those particular sufferings are necessary for any greater good. Similarly, whole communities wiped out or devastated by storms produce the image of innocent men, women, and children asking, "Why me?" in a way that raw theology cannot gloss over. Defenders of theism commonly turn to free will and soul-making responses, famously elaborated in response to the logical puzzle by serious philosophical work. But those lines of defense have clear limits. Free will addresses interpersonal moral evil, but does nothing to explain vast amounts of natural evil or the endemic suffering of non-moral creatures. The brutal mechanisms of evolution and predation are not plausibly accounted for by human moral freedom alone. Soul-making appeals may reframe some suffering as instrumentally valuable for moral development, yet they struggle to justify the intensity, duration, and gratuitousness of many horrendous evils we observe. Skeptical theism, which invites us to accept our epistemic limitations and refrain from inferring divine malevolence from apparently pointless evils, is often advanced as a way out. But skeptical theism exacts a heavy price. It undercuts the reliability of ordinary moral reasoning, renders divine goodness unfalsifiable, and makes theism immune to the kinds of empirical criticism we apply to every other hypothesis. If any instance of suffering can now be explained by inscrutable divine reasons, then we have no principled way to criticize obviously horrific states of affairs or to appeal to moral intuitions that guide our lives. Finally, even if we accept free will, soul formation, or inscrutable purposes as partial answers, an omnipotent God could plausibly have created creatures who freely chose good or fashioned a world in which moral goods are realized without the present scale of gratuitous suffering. The possibility of such worlds means that the theist owes us specific, plausible accounts of why particular tragedies are necessary rather than merely possible. In the absence of those accounts, the cumulative weight of logical pressure, probabilistic inference from horrific examples, the special problem of animal and evolutionary suffering, and the epistemic costs of skeptical theism make the classical claim that an all-powerful, all-loving God permits the world we observe deeply implausible.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from God-Compatible and God-Incompatible. Now, God-Compatible.
I begin by conceding the force of the images invoked by my opponent: the grieving parents, the flattened village, children dying for lack of medicine. Those images are morally urgent and they demand answers, not rhetorical dismissal. But moral urgency is not the same as philosophical demolition. We need to separate two questions that my opponent has elided: the logical problem of evil, which asks whether the very idea of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God is self-contradictory given evil, and the evidential problem, which asks whether the pattern and scale of suffering make belief in such a God unlikely. Conflating them gives emotional power but no decisive refutation. The logical pressure dissolves once we see what genuine libertarian freedom entails. If God values creatures capable of making real moral choices, then those creatures must sometimes choose wrongly. Free will is a metaphysical condition that admits alternative possibilities. To demand that God create beings who are both genuinely free and guaranteed always to choose good is to ask for a logical contradiction. Free, with alternative possibilities, cannot at the same time mean only good outcomes. Think of a doctor who insists on informed consent. To force consent is to destroy the very good the doctor sought: autonomy. Likewise, guaranteeing only good choices would annihilate the very moral agency that makes virtue possible. The burden falls on those who claim God could do the metaphysically impossible to show how that is coherent. On the evidential side, vivid instances of suffering create a powerful prima facie case. But prima facie is not conclusive. We should distinguish apparent gratuitousness, our immediate human reaction, from genuine gratuitousness, an epistemically warranted judgment that no morally sufficient reason could exist. The physician analogy helps. A painful operation now may be necessary for a life of health later. That pain is not senseless once one sees the larger outcome. Many theodicies advance similar moves. Some evils are necessary conditions for higher goods, like moral growth, genuine courage, and relationships that only exist against a backdrop of risk and loss. Other evils may arise from the law-like operation of a robust, intelligible world in which creatures can reliably act and learn. Skeptical humility about our epistemic limits need not become blanket inscrutability. It is reasonable to allow that finite minds may sometimes lack access to justificatory reasons without surrendering ordinary moral reasoning or making God empirically unfalsifiable. Finally, the charge that God could have fashioned a better world without these costs reverses the burden of proof. Show one coherent model in which creatures are truly free in the relevant sense and yet could not do otherwise, or demonstrate that every instance of suffering is morally gratuitous rather than presently inscrutable. Until that burden is met, the coexistence of evil and an all-loving, all-powerful God remains a live, philosophically respectable position.
Now, God-Incompatible.
You gave us the surgeon analogy in three defenses: free will, soul-making, and skeptical theism, and those deserve respect because they address real dimensions of the problem. But they do not, in my view, meet the real challenge: the scale, kinds, and apparent pointlessness of suffering we actually observe. Begin with free will. I grant that libertarian freedom explains some interpersonal evils. Genuine moral agency plausibly entails the possibility of wrongdoing. But that concession is narrowly focused. It does not explain infants crushed by preventable disease, entire villages leveled by storms, or the prolonged agony of non-human animals. These are not cases of moral choice. If freedom explains moral evil, you still owe us an explanation for why the background world, the geology, the pathogens, the predator-prey dynamics, was set up in a way that produces vast, non-moral suffering far beyond what seems necessary to secure free agents. Saying freedom explains some evil is not enough when the ledger of gratuitous pain is overwhelmingly in the red. Soul-making is more charitable, but it suffers the same defect. The surgeon's pain is measured, targeted, and proportionate to a foreseeable good for identifiable patients. By contrast, which virtues require the permanent loss of children, the extinction of communities, or the ceaseless predation that plagues wild animals? Vague assertions that virtue requires struggle collapse unless the theist can give concrete, case-by-case accounts showing that particular horrendous events were necessary means to identifiable higher goods and that no less brutal road existed. Skeptical theism, finally, trades explanatory depth for an epistemic veto. Because we're finite, we cannot judge whether a given evil is gratuitous. But that move has a corrosive cost. If every atrocity can be immunized by appeal to inscrutable divine reasons, then our ordinary moral judgments about injustice, about what should be opposed, lose their footing. Worse, God's goodness becomes unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it is reclassified as merely inscrutable. That is not humility, it is intellectual abdication. You also asked us to accept limits on omnipotence, that God cannot create free creatures who reliably choose good without undermining freedom. That is a serious metaphysical claim, not something to be asserted casually. An omnipotent being, as traditionally conceived, should plausibly be able to instantiate worlds with different laws or psychologies that preserve meaningful choice while vastly reducing gratuitous suffering. If the theist insists otherwise, they must articulate why those alternative worlds are metaphysically impossible rather than merely difficult. The practical demand here is simple. Provide specific, plausible accounts linking particular horrendous evils to necessary greater goods. If theists cannot do that, if every case is met with "you can't know" or it serves soul-making, then the combined force of the logical tension and the evidential weight of gratuitous suffering makes the traditional conception of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God increasingly implausible. Either give us concrete reasons, or accept that God's attributes must be rethought.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now God-Compatible.
Let's be clear about where the debate actually is. My opponent has done the important work of dramatizing the moral horror, the village leveled, the children lost, and those images rightly demand explanation. But vividness is not the same thing as refutation. We've already separated two distinct problems. The logical problem, whether the very idea of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God is contradictory given evil, and the evidential problem, whether the pattern and scale of suffering make belief unlikely. The logical horn collapses once we recognize what genuine free will entails. If God values creatures who are real moral agents, then those creatures must have alternative possibilities. To ask God to create beings who are both genuinely free and guaranteed to choose only good is to ask for a contradiction. Free with real alternatives cannot simultaneously mean only good outcomes. Think of forced consent. If a doctor compels agreement, they have annihilated the very autonomy they claim to respect. That is not a minor concession. It's a principled metaphysical limit on what omnipotence sensibly includes. Logical impossibilities are not things to be achieved by power. My opponent must show how could have created free but infallibly good creatures is coherent, not merely assert it. On the evidential front, yes, the ledger of suffering is heavy, and the examples are heartbreaking. But moving from emotional force to the conclusion that suffering is gratuitous requires epistemic warrant. We should distinguish apparent gratuitousness, our immediate human reaction, from genuine gratuitousness, an evidence-based judgment that no morally sufficient reason exists. Many theodicies explain why certain kinds of pain can be instrumentally necessary for higher goods: moral growth, courage, reliable learning, the integrity of moral relationships. Others point out that a stable, law-like universe that makes moral responsibility meaningful will inevitably produce natural processes that sometimes cause suffering. Skeptical theism, properly framed, is epistemic modesty, not a divine get-out-of-responsibility card. It says, beware of quick inferences to gratuitousness when your local explanatory options are incomplete. It does not require us to stop making moral judgments or to stop protesting evil. It only cautions us against concluding we know the cosmic bookkeeping. My opponent rightly presses the hard cases: infant death, animal pain, and those cases demand answers. My challenge in return is precise. produce one coherent model showing creatures who are genuinely free in the libertarian sense yet could not do otherwise, or else provide decisive reason to believe any particular real suffering is truly gratuitous rather than presently inscrutable. If they cannot, the theist's position, freedom as a necessary condition for deep moral goods, soul-making as a plausible account of some suffering, calibrated skeptical theism to guard against epistemic arrogance, remains a philosophically defensible response. For my closing, I will press the burden of proof. The burden lies with those claiming gratuitous evil, and they must move beyond evocative examples to show metaphysical possibility or present empirical warrant that a particular suffering admits no sufficient reason. Without that, coexistence remains intelligible and demanding absolute removal of all suffering risks destroying the very goods we prize.
Now, God-Incompatible.
You rightly reminded us that vivid suffering does not automatically settle the philosophical question, and I accept that distinction. But let's not lose the wood for the trees. The theist's three-tiered defense, libertarian free will, soul-making, and skeptical theism, cannot jointly shoulder the heavy explanatory burden the world places on them. First, on free will. I grant that genuine moral agency explains some human wrongdoing, but the moral agency explanation simply evaporates in the face of massive natural and non-moral suffering. Why do infants die of preventable disease? Why do entire villages get wiped out by storms? Why do non-human animals endure protracted agony from predation, parasitism, and disease? These are not failures of moral choice. If free will is invoked to justify moral evils, the theist still owes an account for the background design, climate systems, pathogens, animal ecologies, that produces enormous, apparently pointless suffering. Saying, freedom explains some evil, is a partial answer at best. It leaves the bulk of the ledger unexplained. Second, soul-making. The surgeon analogy is instructive. Doctors inflict targeted, proportionate pain to secure a foreseeable greater good for identifiable patients. Soul-making offers only a distant, speculative analog. Which virtues truly require the permanent loss of children, mass extinctions, or centuries of animal suffering? If the claim is that some goods are achievable only through particular horrific events, then produce the case studies. Give us concrete, plausible accounts showing that these specific tragedies were necessary means and that less brutal alternatives were metaphysically impossible. Vague appeals to character or greater goods will not do. Third, skeptical theism. This move invites humility about our epistemic limits, and that humility can be defensible in moderation. But as a general strategy, it is self-defeating. If every atrocity may be insulated by inscrutable divine reasons, then our ordinary moral inferences about justice, blame, and reform are paralyzed. Worse, the claim becomes unfalsifiable. Any evidence against divine goodness can be dismissed as merely beyond our ken. That is not epistemic modesty. It is an intellectual moat protecting an otherwise vulnerable hypothesis. Finally, the theist's appeal to limits on omnipotence is not a neutral observation, but a substantive metaphysical claim. If it is asserted that an omnipotent being could not create genuinely free agents who reliably choose good or could not instantiate a world with vastly less gratuitous suffering, then that assertion requires argument, not supposition. Pressed to show why such worlds are metaphysically impossible, the theist too often retreats to mystery. So the choice is stark and practical. Either supply specific, plausibly necessary links between particular horrendous evils and greater goods, or accept that the traditional package, omnipotence plus omnibenevolence, becomes increasingly implausible. In my closing, I will press this fork. Do we redefine divine attributes to accommodate the data, or do we let the weight of gratuitous suffering count as serious evidence against the classical theistic portrait? The burden rests with those defending the compatibility to offer real, particular explanations, not general assurances of inscrutability.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, God-Compatible.
We all feel the wrenching images my opponent invoked, that visceral refusal to accept innocent suffering. That feeling is morally urgent, and I share it. But urgency is not proof of contradiction. The defenses I've offered fit together. Genuine freedom explains moral evil, because freedom is a greater good that cannot coherently be willed into existence. Soul-making explains why some suffering can shape courage, compassion, and moral growth. greater good and consequence reasoning show that certain evils are necessary conditions for higher goods. And skeptical theism reminds us that our epistemic limits make apparently gratuitous evils plausibly non-gratuitous. The surgeon analogy still holds. Painful interventions can prevent worse outcomes. The charge that God could create free beings who always choose good misunderstands metaphysical limits. Freedom ruled out guaranteed goodness. The burden of proof rests on claiming gratuitous horror. Given plausible theodicies and our limited perspective, that burden is not met. Judge by coherence and reason, not by the intensity of our grief alone.
Now, God-Incompatible.
Why do innocent children, animals, and whole villages endure what looks like pointless horror? That single question crystallizes both objections I've defended. First, the logical form objection. If God is willing but not able to prevent gratuitous suffering, God is not omnipotent. If able but not willing, God is not omnibenevolent. Second, the evidential form objection. The scale, kinds, and apparent pointlessness of suffering make the existence of such a God unlikely. We've heard free will and soul-making replies, and I concede some evils plausibly serve higher goods, but those replies stumble on natural disasters, animal pain, and the staggering random intensity of many tragedies. Skeptical theism, meanwhile, dissolves our ability to trust moral reasoning and renders God's goodness unfalsifiable. An omnipotent creator could, in principle, bring about free creatures who tend overwhelmingly toward good, or a world with far less gratuitous suffering. Absent plausible, specific reasons for particular tragedies, the traditional theistic picture fails. For those who mourn, that failure matters. It is the weighty reason to reject an all-powerful, all-loving deity as traditionally conceived.